I was heading to my wife's funeral alone. In the car, I had left a rose, a thermos of coffee, and a note I planned to bury with her. But when I stopped by the garage around the corner, my old mechanic suddenly ran out of the bay, with a twisted expression on his face. He was shouting something, waving his arms, and in that moment, I understood. It wasn't about the car. Someone really didn't want me to make it there. But I did. And right at the cemetery, someone in the family turned white as a sheet, forever. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Harold Mason. I was 76 years old, a retired postal clerk from Dayton, Ohio. For 38 years, I had stood behind the same wooden counter at the Oak Ridge post office, sorting letters, weighing packages, and offering forced smiles to neighbors who never quite remembered my name. My job was routine, my gestures mechanical, but they gave me a place in the world. After retirement, the world slowly forgot me, but Sarah didn't. She never did. Sarah was my wife. She had hair the color of rusted maple leaves and eyes so light they looked silver in the winter. She died on a Thursday morning at 5:41 a.m., and I remember that because the mantel clock had just chimed once, and I had been awake for hours listening to the breath in her throat break into intervals, like a car engine failing in deep frost. I had placed a folded hand towel on her chest the night before because the hospice nurse said it might help with the pressure. It didn't. She passed in the back bedroom, under a quilt she made herself in 1989, the one with the pine trees and the stitched initials. I didn't cry then. I just sat there with my hand on hers until her fingers went cold. I remember staring at the ceiling, at a water stain that looked like a bird mid-flight. That stain had always bothered her, but I never fixed it. Now I didn't want to. The morning of the funeral, I woke before sunrise. I put on the navy blue suit she always said made me look like a judge. It hung looser than I remembered. My belt buckle tapped against my hip bones. I shaved carefully, using her old compact mirror because the main bathroom one had a crack that distorted my left eye. Afterward, I made black coffee and drank it in silence, standing by the window that looked out over the frozen garden. The soil had crusted over with early frost. Sarah's tulips never made it through October. The house smelled of lavender and paper. Her books still stood in neat lines on the shelf, organized alphabetically by author. I couldn't bring myself to touch them. On the kitchen counter sat a yellowed recipe card for lemon pie in her handwriting, tucked under a magnet shaped like a cardinal. She loved birds, especially red ones, said they were messengers. I never believed in signs, but that morning I saw one sitting on the bare branch outside. I stepped into the garage. The air was thick with the smell of motor oil and old paint. The fluorescent light flickered when I turned it on. My Buick sat there, covered in a thin coat of dust, as if it too had been waiting. I wiped the windshield with a rag and turned the key to check the battery. The engine coughed once and then settled into a low, familiar hum. I had changed the oil last week, rotated the tires, checked the wipers. It was a ritual, something to keep my hands from shaking. Before getting in, I took the rose from the kitchen table, her favorite kind, deep red with petals that curled inward like secrets. I had kept it in a glass of water overnight, and now it was fresh, alive in a way she no longer could be. I placed it gently on the passenger seat, on top of a folded wool scarf she had knitted last Christmas. The same scarf she wore to the grocery store even in spring, just to spite the wind. Next to the rose, I placed a small thermos filled with coffee and a note I had written by hand the night before. I didn't know what I planned to do with it. Bury it? Burn it? Read it aloud to the dirt? It simply felt wrong not to write her something. I had spent 5 decades speaking to her across the breakfast table, across pillowcases, across silence, and now words felt both too heavy and too hollow. The dashboard still had that faint scent of cinnamon from when she spilled her tea 2 winters ago. I had never cleaned it fully. Her seatbelt clicked softly when I buckled it, out of habit, as if she were still there, sitting quietly, folding her hands in her lap the way she did during long drives. As I pulled out of the driveway, the wind carried dry leaves across the asphalt. They skittered like small animals, chasing the sun. The rearview mirror reflected the window of the guest room where she spent her final days. I had closed the curtains. I didn't want the house to watch me leave. The street was still, as it always was at that hour. Mailboxes stood like silent sentinels. Driveways were full of cars, but no people. Everyone was still inside, still warm, still together. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather worn smooth where her fingers used to rest during Sunday errands. I whispered her name once, just to hear it in my mouth. About 10 minutes into the drive, something felt off. The brakes were soft, softer than they should have been. The pedal gave too easily under my foot. I told myself it was just the cold. Rubber hardens in low temperatures. But the warning light on the dashboard blinked once, then again. It was orange, not red, and I remembered Sarah always saying, "Orange means be careful, red means pull over." So I kept going. I shouldn't have. I turned onto Central Avenue to stop by the garage, the one I had trusted since 1982. It was on my way. A quick check, nothing more. Just peace of mind. I glanced once more at the rose. It had tipped to the side, leaning gently against the thermos, its stem catching the sunlight in a way that made it look almost alive. I didn't know then that this small detour would change the course of everything. I didn't know that someone had been in the garage after me, that hands other than mine had touched the underside of the car. I only knew that the scent of rose and coffee mingled in the car, like a memory trying to survive. And I was just a man trying to get to a funeral without falling apart. I pulled up to the garage. The sign creaked overhead in the wind. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to it tick as it cooled. In the silence, I reached over and straightened the rose on the seat, then touched the envelope beside it. It was still sealed. I wasn't ready to say goodbye, but I was already on the road. When I pulled into the gravel lot behind the garage, I noticed the old rusted barrel near the fence line still had the same tilt it always did, like a man listening in on secrets he wasn't supposed to hear. The air smelled of scorched rubber and old coolant, the sort of smell you never forget once it seeps into your clothes. The wind had picked up, blowing dry leaves across the lot like paper confessions. I turned off the engine and sat still for a moment. The ticking of the cooling metal echoed softly through the car's shell. My hands were steady on the wheel, but there was a humming in the base of my skull, like something was wrong, and my body knew it before my brain did. I had come here for peace of mind. I had known the mechanic for years. Claude. He wasn't just a man with a wrench. He was a man who listened to engines like a priest listens to confessions. He could tell you the history of a car by the sound it made when it backed up. That morning, he stepped out of the garage with a rag slung over his shoulder and grease under his fingernails. I recognized his walk right away, but something was off about his posture. It wasn't the easy pace of a man going to greet an old friend. It was rushed, sharp, and his eyes were wide, like he'd just seen something he couldn't quite explain. I cracked the window. The cold bit through the opening like a warning. Claude started waving both hands over his head, as if trying to flag down a jet on a runway. His mouth moved, but I couldn't hear through the glass. He pointed frantically at the front of my car, then motioned for me to stop. I had already turned off the ignition, but I flicked the hazard lights out of habit. A lifetime in the post office had trained me in procedure. When in doubt, follow protocol. He reached the driver's door and tapped the glass with his knuckle. I rolled it down. He leaned in and hissed words I barely caught, the wind taking half of them. But I heard the most important part. Don't touch the brakes. My foot was already near the pedal, reflexively ready to push it when I moved the car again. I froze. He opened the hood and disappeared under it without another word. The scent of oil got stronger, mingling now with something else, metallic, sharp, like rust and blood. I got out and stood near the front bumper, watching him work. His hands moved quickly, wiping, probing, unscrewing. His brow furrowed deeper with each passing minute. When he stood up, he held something in his hand. A piece of rubber hose, sliced clean through. Not torn, not frayed. Cut. A deliberate, surgical sever. He held it like it was evidence in a courtroom. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. He moved underneath the car next, sliding on his back across the concrete slab. I stood there, arms crossed against the wind, watching the clouds gather like heavy thoughts. When he rolled back out, he looked older than when he went in. He held a small tray filled with black sludge and tiny metal flakes, so small they looked like glitter, but darker, heavier. He tilted the tray toward me. Brake fluid contaminated with steel shavings. That wasn't age or wear. That was sabotage. He didn't accuse anyone. Claude wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions, but his silence was heavier than any question. He shook his head once, slowly, and said I was lucky. Lucky I'd come in. Lucky I hadn't hit the highway. Lucky I was still standing. I nodded, but luck didn't feel like the right word. Luck doesn't slice hoses and sprinkle metal into brake lines. Someone did this. Someone who knew what they were doing. I stepped back into the car and looked at the passenger seat. The rose had shifted again, now leaning toward the glove box like it was tired. The note I had written was still sealed. The thermos had tipped slightly but hadn't spilled. Everything looked the same, but the air in the car felt different, like it knew, like it had been holding its breath the whole drive. I stared at the dashboard. Dust had collected in the corners of the speedometer. The odometer blinked quietly. The warning light for the brakes had gone out. It was always inconsistent, sometimes on, sometimes off. I thought of Sarah, how she used to tap on the dash when lights flickered, as if sheer will could fix electrical problems. I thought about how she always reminded me to check the tires, the oil, the washer fluid, even the trunk. She never liked to drive on rainy days, said she didn't trust wet roads, said too much could go wrong too fast. Claude came around and opened the driver's side again. He handed me the hose segment wrapped in a rag and told me to keep it. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. I tucked it into the side pocket of my coat, the same coat I had worn every winter since Sarah bought it for me 10 years ago. The lining was frayed, and one of the buttons had come loose, but it still smelled faintly of cedar and the closet where I kept it. I looked out toward the road, then back at the garage. A crow landed on the power line and stared down like a sentry. I didn't believe in omens, but there was something about the way it sat there, silent and unmoving, that made me think twice. The next step was supposed to be simple. Go to the cemetery, stand by the grave, say a few words, place the rose, and leave. But now the route had changed. Not just the physical one, but the path inside my head. There was a weight to the morning I hadn't expected, a shape to the silence that felt unnatural. I sat in the car a long time before turning the key again. The engine turned over with a low groan. I adjusted the mirror and saw my own eyes looking back at me. Eyes that looked more alert than tired, more calculating than grieving. The funeral could wait. There was someone I needed to remember, someone who had access to the car, someone who knew how to hurt quietly. As I pulled away from the garage, I kept my foot far from the brake. I didn't test it. I didn't press. I let the car coast gently forward. I passed the crow, still watching, and turned onto the main road. The rose didn't move. The note stayed folded. but my grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I felt the faint rustle of the rag in my coat pocket pressing against my ribs. Someone had tried to stop the car, but I was still driving. And now I knew. I sat in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes after returning home, the engine off, the heater ticking with leftover warmth, and the silence around me as thick as wool. The wind had changed direction. I could tell because the neighbors' wind chimes, shaped like little copper birds, were now clinking against the siding instead of each other. That was the kind of thing Sarah always noticed. Small changes in the air, the way light fell on different walls at different times of year. I never cared for those details until she was gone. Now, they haunted me. The house looked different from the outside. I had painted the trim dark green last spring, thinking it would make the windows look deeper, more alive. But now the whole place just looked tired. The siding had begun to peel along the bottom edge, and the porch steps creaked under my boots as I climbed them. Inside, everything smelled of lemon polish and stale air. I hadn't opened the windows in weeks. Sarah used to insist on airing the place out every Sunday, no matter the weather. She believed in movement, even when everything inside her was slowing down. I placed the rose back in the glass and left it on the counter. The petals had softened, a few of them curling at the tips like they were whispering to each other. I ran my fingers along the edge of the dining table. The wood was scarred in places, knife marks from when I used to cut bread without a board, stains from years of dinners, birthdays, quiet mornings. I went to the cupboard and pulled out a tin of crackers and a jar of peanut butter. It was the kind of meal you make when you don't want to think about eating. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the empty chair across from me. Sarah's chair. It still had the cushion with the small tear at the seam, the one she always promised to fix, but never did. Her reading glasses sat nearby, the arms folded neatly, lenses dusty. I hadn't moved them since the hospital took her away. Part of me hoped I never would. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful. It felt expectant, like it was waiting for me to notice something. I walked into the den and sat in the armchair near the fireplace, the one with the worn armrests and the indent in the cushion where my body had spent years. I leaned back and looked up at the wooden beam that ran across the ceiling, the inner bar, Sarah used to call it. She said it held the house together. I never thought about it much, but lately I found myself staring at it, wondering what might happen if it ever cracked. My eyes drifted to the side table where an old brass clock sat ticking faintly. The hands moved in perfect rhythm, but the glass was fogged on the inside. I had never cleaned it properly. Time in this house moved differently now. Not forward, not backward, just in place, like a pendulum with no purpose. It was while sitting there, in that stillness, that the image of Matt came back into my mind. My son-in-law, Sarah's only daughter's husband. He had borrowed the car after the service, said he needed to clear his head, and I hadn't thought much of it at the time. He returned it without a word, keys left on the hook by the door, like it meant nothing. I hadn't driven it since then until this morning. Now I thought of his hands, clean, well manicured, always tapping on his phone during family dinners. He never touched tools, never helped fix the sink or patch the gutter, but he had confidence, the kind of cool precision that came from someone who always thought 3 steps ahead. Sarah never trusted that kind of calm. She used to say still water hides deep poison. The more I sat in that chair, the more I began to stitch pieces together. The car had been fine before the funeral. I knew it because I'd checked it myself, the way I always did. But after Matt drove it, things began to shift. The brake line didn't cut itself. The flakes of metal didn't crawl into the fluid on their own. I stood up slowly, knees popping with age and cold, and walked down the narrow hallway to the spare room, the one Matt and my daughter used when they visited. It was empty now, but the scent of his cologne still lingered, a sharp chemical smell like polished glass. On the bedside table was a coaster with a coffee ring, the kind of thing Sarah would have scolded me for. I checked the closet. Empty hangers, dust along the edges, but the floorboards creaked differently there. One plank, near the back wall, felt looser than the others. I pressed on it. It dipped slightly, a soft give, like a breath being held. I didn't pry it up. Not yet. I wasn't ready for what I might find. Instead, I turned to the bookshelf, scanning spines that hadn't been touched in years. One caught my eye. Sarah's journal. She didn't write often, but every few months she would jot down a page or two. She never hid it, but she also never offered it up. I opened it to the last written page. The ink was faint, like she had been too tired to press the pen fully, but her handwriting was unmistakable. It said only this: "If something happens, it won't be an accident. Trust the things he doesn't say." I closed the journal gently and placed it back where it was. My hands felt cold, even though the house was warm. I returned to the den and stood beneath the ceiling beam again, staring up at the wood grain. That inner bar, strong and quiet, holding everything in place. It hadn't cracked yet, but I saw now that pressure had been building for some time. I walked to the front hallway and pulled open the drawer where we kept spare keys. Among them was a duplicate for the Buick, one I had forgotten even existed. I turned it in my palm, feeling the small groove where Sarah had once carved an X with the kitchen knife to tell it apart. I remembered that moment. She said, "Always mark what matters. You never know when you'll need to know the difference." I placed the key in my breast pocket and walked out to the porch. The air had cooled further. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and fell silent. I looked down the street, to the corner where the stop sign leaned slightly after a windstorm 2 years ago. It was still bent, still ignored. The sky was gray, not the kind that threatened rain, but the kind that dulled the edges of everything. I reached into my coat pocket and touched the rag-wrapped hose segment the mechanic had given me. It felt heavier now, not just with grease and rubber, but with something deeper, intent. Matt had driven the car last. He had keys. He had silence. And I had been asleep. But I wasn't anymore. The garage had always been my domain. Not a workspace, not a hobby room, just a place where things waited to be fixed. Shelves of half-used cans of paint, rags stiff from age, tools that hadn't been touched in years but remained arranged with a kind of reverence. It smelled of sawdust and motor oil, but under that was something more permanent. Old rubber, sweat, and time. My boots echoed against the cement floor as I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The temperature dropped immediately. It was the kind of cold that didn't come from weather, but from stillness, the kind of cold that collects in places forgotten by movement. I turned on the single bulb that hung from the center beam. It flickered twice before holding steady, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. Cobwebs collected in the corners, thin like hair. The air felt tight in my chest. I hadn't spent much time in there since Sarah got sick. She used to hate the smell and always complained that it clung to my sweaters. But I kept it clean. I kept it in order. Against the back wall was the old metal cabinet I'd inherited from my father. The paint had long since chipped away, exposing patches of dull silver and reddish rust. One of the doors hung crooked, and the bottom drawer always stuck. But the top shelf, where I kept the tin box, remained untouched. I reached up, my shoulder creaking from the effort, and pulled it down. It was heavier than I remembered. A rectangular tin with faded lettering on the lid. Holiday butter cookies. The kind that used to come with a paper doily and layers of sugar-dusted shapes. But no cookies lived in it now. They hadn't for decades. Inside were screws, bolts, washers, stripped wire ends, and small screws from electronics I'd disassembled over the years. It was the kind of box every man collects without meaning to. A graveyard of parts from things long gone. But there was something else in there. tucked beneath the second layer of bolts. A folded receipt, brittle and browned at the corners. The ink had smudged in places, but I could still read the essentials. The receipt wasn't mine. It was from a place I didn't recognize, a small garage in Southgate, printed with yesterday's date. The listed service was vague. Fluid adjustment and specialty line check. The license plate number scrawled at the bottom matched mine. I held it under the light, the paper trembling in my fingers. I hadn't taken the car anywhere since the last oil change. The handwriting wasn't mine. I knew it immediately. The loops on the M were too high, and the 5 had a slash through it. A European affectation. Matt always wrote his numbers that way. I remembered once asking about it. He said it helped him avoid confusion in medical forms. I hadn't thought about it again until now. I set the receipt aside and rummaged deeper into the box. My hands moved without thinking, sorting through the metal like memory. I found a plastic bag containing a few mismatched screws and a small army knife I thought I'd lost. Beneath that, at the very bottom, was an old flashlight. I clicked it once. Dead. I clicked again out of stubbornness. Still dead. I made a mental note to replace the batteries and tossed it on the workbench. Beside the workbench sat the red metal toolbox Sarah had given me on our 15th anniversary. She had wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with garden twine. Said it was to keep your chaos contained. I hadn't used it much in recent years, but the sound of its clasps opening was as familiar as breathing. I opened it now, methodically, checking the compartments one by one, as if I'd missed something critical, something buried. But the tools were right where they always were. Hammer with the cracked wooden handle, measuring tape that snapped halfway when extended, Phillips screwdriver with the blue rubber grip worn smooth. I sat on the work stool, the metal cold through my jeans, and let the receipt rest beside me on the bench. I stared at it as though it might vanish if I blinked. The silence pressed in again. The only sound was the clock I'd hung in the corner decades ago, its second hand dragging across the dial like a slow breath. The clock had stopped working properly in 2007. Sarah wanted to replace it, but I insisted it still had character. "It's just slow," I told her. "Like me." She laughed and left it up. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the segment of brake hose Claude had given me. I unwrapped it from the rag and laid it next to the receipt. It looked harmless, just a piece of rubber tubing, but the clean slice across it said everything. Not torn, not cracked, cut. I ran my finger along the edge and felt the precision of the damage. Whoever had done it had known exactly what they were doing. My mind kept circling back to Matt, the calmness in his voice after the funeral, the casual way he handed back the keys. The week before, he had offered to help manage things around the house while I was grieving, said it might be too much for me. At the time, I thought he was trying to be helpful. Now I wondered if it was something else. I stood and crossed the garage to the shelf where I kept old license plate frames and spare bulbs. On a whim, I opened the small drawer beneath it. Inside was an old spiral notebook, half full of sketches and lists. I had once used it to track oil changes and tire rotations. The last entry was dated 6 months ago with a note. "Brakes fine, no issues." Nothing since. Nothing until now. I flipped to the back of the notebook and began to write again. Just a few lines. Date. Time. What Claude had said. What I'd found in the box. I didn't know why I needed a record, only that I did. My handwriting trembled slightly. I hadn't written anything of substance since Sarah died, but this was different. This felt necessary. I packed the receipt, the hose, and the notebook page into a zippered pouch and placed it in the drawer where I used to keep Sarah's gardening gloves. The gloves were still there, soft, faded, smelling faintly of earth. I folded them and placed them beneath the pouch, as if she could protect what I had found. I left the garage door closed when I went back inside. The house felt warmer now. Or maybe it was just the difference in air. I returned to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and watched the light move across the tiles. Outside, the neighbors' wind chimes had gone silent again. The wind had shifted once more. Something was changing. I could feel it in the bones of the house. The box of bolts was back on the shelf where it belonged, but something had been unearthed. Not just parts or paper, something older, quieter, a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying. And it was only beginning to stir. The mirror over the sink had a crack down the left side, not sharp enough to cut skin, but deep enough to slice the reflection. I stood there in the dim bathroom light, toothbrush forgotten in my hand, and stared at the face that looked back at me, creased, sagging, pale with blue under the eyes. But it wasn't the age that startled me. It was the stillness, the expressionless silence of a man who had begun to notice things he wasn't meant to. My own eyes didn't look like mine anymore. They looked like someone else's, someone watching. The overhead light buzzed softly, a faint electrical whine that hadn't gone away since last winter. Sarah used to hum while brushing her teeth, even when she was too tired to stand without leaning on the sink. That small habit, now gone, made the silence in the bathroom almost unbearable. I turned off the light and let the morning sun through the frosted window do the work. It cast everything in pale gray, a color that reminded me of bed sheets in hospital rooms and the kind of sky that offers no promises. I moved slowly through the hallway, my hand brushing along the wall as I passed our old wedding photo. We had been so young, my tie too wide, her bouquet too large. We both looked like we had no idea what was coming. I didn't look long, just long enough to feel the tug of memory pulling at my spine like gravity. I descended the basement stairs with the careful rhythm I'd developed over the past decade. Right foot, then left. Use the rail. Breathe steady. My knees didn't like the damp air down there. The concrete floor was always colder than the rest of the house. Sarah hated the basement, said it smelled like rust and mildew. She wasn't wrong. But it was also where I kept the things that didn't fit anywhere else. Boxes of photos, old cameras, cables, wires, empty jars, a film projector I never learned how to use. And the DVR unit from the outdoor cameras. It sat behind the tool cabinet, a black box with blinking lights, always humming faintly, like a heart refusing to stop. The security system was something I had installed myself 20 years ago after we'd had a car broken into. It was analog, outdated, clunky. But I had kept it up, replacing tapes with a hard drive, wiring the feeds through the attic. It gave me comfort, the kind that comes from routine and quiet control. Cameras watched the front porch, the driveway, the side gate, and the garage. Not because I was paranoid, but because I had learned long ago that no one ever sees what they don't look for. I turned on the small monitor, the one with the dust-smudged screen and the soft yellow glow. It took a while to load, long enough for my hands to go cold around the edge of the table. I navigated the clumsy interface until I found the date I needed, the night after Sarah's funeral, the night Matt borrowed my car. At first, the footage was uneventful. He appeared in the frame at 9:12 p.m., walking out of the house with the keys in one hand and his phone in the other. He was wearing a dark coat, the same one he had worn at the service. His pace was measured, not hurried. He looked up once toward the camera and paused just long enough for the motion sensor to trigger the timestamp. Then he turned his back and approached the car. He opened the driver's door and stood beside it for a moment, still on his phone. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. A folded cloth, gray or blue, hard to tell in the low-resolution footage. He bent down near the front wheel. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath fogging the glass. He was doing something near the wheel well. His hands moved with purpose, not fumbling or uncertain. After a minute, he stood again, glanced around, and then entered the car. The brake lights lit up a moment later as he reversed slowly out of frame. I rewound the footage and played it again. Slower this time. My chest tightened. There was no doubt in his movement, no hesitation. He wasn't checking the car. He was altering it. I sat back in the metal chair, the kind with the torn vinyl cushion that stuck to your skin in the summer. My pulse was loud in my ears. There it was, plain as day. Not speculation, not suspicion, proof. And he had looked directly at the camera. Not long, just a flick of the eyes, as if daring me to find him. I copied the footage to a thumb drive, one I had stored in a drawer filled with old batteries and expired coupons. I labeled it D1 and stuck a piece of masking tape on the side. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed the cap back onto the USB stick. I held it for a moment, still warm from the port, and looked around the basement like I expected someone else to be there. But it was just me. Me and the shadows. I climbed the stairs slower than usual, each step a deliberate effort. Back upstairs, I passed the hallway mirror again. The same face stared back, but this time I wasn't looking for age or sadness. I was looking for confirmation. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was I still a man who could trust his own judgment? I walked into the living room and opened the roll-top desk where I kept important documents: birth certificates, insurance, Sarah's medical records. I placed the thumb drive inside a manila envelope and slid it beneath a folder labeled Estate HM. Then I locked the drawer, not out of fear, just out of caution. I sat in Sarah's chair. The cushion still held the shape of her. The throw blanket she used for her legs still hung over the back. I reached over and picked up her glasses, the ones I'd left untouched for weeks, and folded them slowly. The room smelled faintly of her hand lotion, almond and something floral, a scent that had no name but lived in every corner of the house. I stayed in that chair for hours, watching light move across the floor, thinking not just about what Matt had done, but why. I replayed conversations, gestures, tone, the way he had been just a little too helpful, the way he had suggested that maybe I sell the house and move into something smaller, the way he had started handling things like he was already in charge. I thought of the way he smiled at the funeral, subdued, but controlled. The kind of smile a man gives when he's rehearsed what grief is supposed to look like. I remembered how he spoke to the other relatives, quiet, efficient, like a man taking inventory after a flood. The sun dipped below the trees, and the living room grew dim. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't move. I just listened to the ticking of the wall clock above the fireplace, the one that Sarah had bought at a yard sale in 1983. Its second hand stuck every few minutes before jerking forward, a stuttering heartbeat in the silence. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Matt wasn't just careless. He wasn't just cold. He was prepared. And preparation meant planning. And planning meant motive. The question wasn't just what he had done. The question was how long he had been waiting to do it. And I intended to find out. The morning of the burial, the ground was still hard from the last frost, the kind of cold that lived just below the surface, pretending to be spring on the outside while holding on to winter beneath. I could feel it in the soles of my shoes when I stepped onto the grass, damp, stubborn, and heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that clings to skin, not from reverence, but from waiting. A wind moved slowly through the trees, dragging brittle leaves across the headstones like forgotten notes of a song no one remembered how to finish. I had dressed in layers, wool under flannel, my black coat buttoned to the top, scarf wrapped twice around my neck, a knitted pair of gloves with a hole in the left thumb. Sarah made those gloves for me 3 winters ago, using leftover yarn from a blanket she never finished. The funeral director said we could have used the indoor chapel, but Sarah had always insisted on being outdoors. People forget how alive the world is until they stand over death, she once told me after attending a friend's burial in the pouring rain. I never forgot those words. I remembered them that morning as I stood under a gray sky, holding a single rose and a piece of paper folded 4 times. There were maybe 24 people in attendance. Some I hadn't seen in years. Neighbors who used to stop by when Sarah baked pies, cousins whose names I could no longer recall without effort. Most stood stiffly, their collars up against the wind, their eyes darting between the casket and the ground. I saw my daughter standing beside Matt. She wore a black wool coat and her mother's earrings. She didn't cry, just stared straight ahead, jaw locked, her fingers curled around the edge of a handkerchief that never moved. Matt stood beside her with one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding an umbrella that he never opened. He had that same calm expression, the one I used to think meant maturity. But now I knew it was something colder, something calculated. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as the priest began to speak, voice soft and even, like he was reading a script he didn't need to believe in. The casket rested on 2 narrow straps above the grave. The wood looked darker than I remembered picking out, mahogany, polished to a dull sheen. Sarah would have called it excessive. She wanted something plain, but my daughter insisted on something respectable. I didn't argue. I had stopped arguing the week Sarah stopped eating. The rose in my hand had dried slightly at the edges. I had kept it in the refrigerator overnight, wrapped in a damp paper towel, just like Sarah used to do with herbs. The paper in my coat pocket felt heavier than it should have, the creases stiff and deliberate. I had read the note a dozen times before leaving the house. Her handwriting, slanted and fading, filled only a quarter of the page, but the words echoed louder than anything the priest said that morning. If something happens to me, don't assume it was time. Some people wait for the end to get what they want. I had found it tucked into a book she kept by the bed, The Old Ways, a collection of essays about walking. She loved that book, reread it every spring. I used to tease her for dog-earing pages, but she said it was the only way to remember where she left her heart. When the priest stepped back and motioned for the family to come forward, I didn't move. I let the others go first. My daughter placed a hand on the casket, whispered something I couldn't hear. Matt bent slightly, adjusted his tie, then looked at me. Just for a second. A look like he was checking to see if I was watching. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. When my turn came, I stepped up slowly, the frost crackling beneath my shoes. I laid the rose gently across the center of the casket, just above the brass handle. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the note. I didn't unfold it. I didn't read it aloud. I simply slid it beneath the rose, tucked it there like a bookmark in a closed story. The wind caught the edge of the paper, fluttered it once, then let it be. No one asked what it was. No one reached for it. But I saw the priest glance down at it, then quickly look away. And I saw Matt stiffen, just slightly. His hand, the one not holding the umbrella, moved back into his coat pocket, as if searching for something, or hiding something. The casket began its descent. The mechanism groaned slightly, metal on metal, until the straps lowered it gently into the ground. A hollow sound followed, dirt loosening, air shifting, the weight of something permanent settling into the cold. The temperature seemed to drop another 5 degrees. People began to drift away in pairs and small groups. Conversations started quietly, the kind of small talk used to escape emotion. Someone mentioned the coffee reception. Someone else talked about traffic on the highway. I stood at the edge of the grave, my hands in my pockets, watching the soil as if expecting it to move. Matt approached from the side. He didn't speak, just stood there beside me, shoulder to shoulder, his breath visible in the cold. I could smell the sharpness of his cologne, the same one he wore the night after the funeral. I didn't look at him. I didn't have to. His silence was loud enough. A groundskeeper appeared with a wheelbarrow and a shovel. The real part was about to begin. The part where the earth reclaims its own. I turned and walked away before the first shovel of dirt fell. I didn't want to hear it. Sarah hated that sound, said it was the loneliest sound in the world. Back at the car, I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. The rose was gone. The note was buried, but the weight in my chest hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown heavier, like the ground itself was pressing upward, trying to tell me something. I looked at the rearview mirror. The reflection was empty. No one behind me. No movement. Just the headstones, the gray sky, and the crows gathering on the bare limbs of a maple tree near the fence line. One of them tilted its head, staring toward the grave I had just left. I pulled out slowly, the tires crunching over gravel. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I let the silence sit with me, its hands folded neatly in its lap. There was something about the air that day, something too still. The temperature of the earth was not just cold, it was expectant, and I could feel it now. Whatever had been set in motion was not finished. Not yet. I arrived at the reception hall an hour after the burial. The parking lot was already half full, a scattered lineup of sedans and SUVs, their windshields streaked from the drizzle that had started somewhere between the cemetery and Main Street. The air was damp, saturated with the smell of pavement, faded cologne, and plastic umbrellas still dripping by the door. I sat in the car for a moment, engine off, listening to the idle tick of cooling metal. My coat was still damp at the cuffs, and the scarf around my neck held the scent of earth and cold wood. The rose was gone, the note was buried, and yet something in me felt unfinished, like I had only folded the first page of a story I didn't yet understand. Inside, the hall was warm but dim, lit by overhead chandeliers that gave off a yellowish hue, softening the sharp corners of grief. Round tables were set with white linens and centerpieces of artificial lilies, the kind that always looked one breath away from dust. People moved in and out of small conversational clusters, speaking in low voices, sipping coffee from paper cups. Finger foods lined a table near the back wall. Cheese cubes, cold cuts, slices of dry banana bread resting on plastic trays wrapped in crinkled cellophane. The whole room felt temporary, like something set up quickly and meant to be forgotten just as fast. I found a seat at the edge of the room, near the window. Outside, the sky hung low and heavy, and the trees across the parking lot had turned a shade of brown-gray that suggested they were ready to let go of everything. I watched the water pool beneath the tires of a black pickup, watched the ripples build and fall. The sound of polite laughter and shallow condolences buzzed behind me, like the murmur of bees in a dying garden. Matt entered 20 minutes later. He came in with his coat folded over one arm, no umbrella, a spot of water darkening his shoulder. He shook someone's hand, patted someone else on the back, and smiled the way men do when they know the room is watching. His smile was practiced, tight, deliberate, just the right balance of somber and composed. He wore a charcoal suit with a pale lavender shirt, no tie. Sarah would have noticed that. She had always said real mourning didn't need accessories. I watched him move through the crowd with the ease of someone who belonged everywhere. He stopped to speak to my daughter, kissed her cheek, and whispered something in her ear that made her close her eyes. Then he moved toward me. I could feel his steps before I saw them, like a change in temperature. When he reached my table, he didn't sit. He rested a hand on the back of the chair opposite mine and looked at me for a moment too long. I didn't meet his gaze. Instead, I placed a small object on the table between us, a printed photo, grainy and dark, with a timestamp in the bottom corner. It showed him outside my garage, bent over the front wheel of my car, hands hidden by shadow. He froze. The color began to leave his face slowly, as though drained by something invisible, pulled out from the edges like ink in water. His jaw slackened, his lips parted, his eyes darted briefly to the photo, then to me, then back again. And in that tiny flicker, the entire mask he wore, every thread of performance, every note of control, began to unravel. He tried to speak, I think. His mouth moved, but no words came, only a faint sound, like breath struggling through cotton. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. I didn't need to say anything. The silence between us was a sculpture, carved sharp and high by everything I had seen, everything I had pieced together. The photo was only the surface. Beneath it lived the brake hose, the altered receipt, the time-stamped footage, the knowledge of exactly when he had slipped the knife through rubber and sealed his intent into my car. He knew. And he knew I knew. He stumbled slightly, caught the back of a chair with his hand. A drop of sweat rolled down the side of his temple despite the coolness of the room. His shirt collar wilted slightly, the color rising and then vanishing just as fast. His eyes began to search, across the room, toward the crowd, toward the windows, as if there might be a door he hadn't seen before. An exit not yet noticed, but there wasn't. He lowered himself slowly into the chair across from me. His knees bent like someone twice his age. He reached for the photo but didn't touch it. His fingers hovered above it, trembling faintly. I watched a line of color rise along his neck, bright red, and then vanish again, drained by whatever it was that gripped his spine. We sat there like that for a long time. I let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Not for me. For him. For the man who had calculated so carefully, who had cut a line and sealed his mouth and thought the world would keep turning for him as it always had. Eventually, he stood. Not suddenly. Not with panic. Just slow, like gravity had finally found him. He left the photo on the table, walked to the restroom, or at least pretended to. I never saw him return. My daughter came to sit beside me a few minutes later. She asked if I was all right. I nodded. She said the banana bread was dry. I nodded again. She said nothing more, just placed her hand over mine and sat with me in silence. Her fingers were cold, like the earth that morning. When the hall began to empty, I rose and folded the photo carefully, slipping it into my coat pocket. I passed the tables of untouched food, the empty chairs, the crumpled napkins stained with coffee rings. The lilies in the centerpieces looked less plastic in the low light. For a moment, I imagined Sarah laughing at that, saying even fake things try to look honest in the dark. Outside, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain. I stood beneath the overhang, watching the parking lot shimmer. Drops hit the windshield of Matt's car in slow, rhythmic taps, like the beginning of an apology. But it never came, and that was fine by me. The house always felt heavier after people left. It was as if their conversations, their footsteps, their breath had soaked into the furniture and lingered long after the door closed behind them. That evening, after the reception, after the condolences and handshakes and the forced smiles that hung on my face like someone else's skin, I returned home and locked the front door with a kind of finality. The deadbolt slid in with a clean metallic click. I turned off the porch light and leaned against the door for a long while, listening to the absence. It was quiet the way only an old house can be quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get from silence, but the kind you get from knowing every creak, every tick of the baseboard, every shift in the wooden bones. The thermostat clicked and sighed as the heater kicked in. The faint scent of burnt dust and warm air crept through the vents. Somewhere in the walls, pipes groaned with age. I took off my coat, hung it on the same brass hook Sarah always used, and walked barefoot across the worn rug in the hallway. My socks picked up specks of grit and stray pine needles from the wreath that had fallen days ago and never been replaced. I passed the living room where the lamp on the side table was still on. Its light spilled softly onto the couch, which sagged slightly on the left side from years of her curling into that corner with a book or a mug of tea. Her afghan still lay draped over the armrest, folded, untouched. I didn't stop there. I kept walking until I reached the small study near the back of the house, a room Sarah used more than I did, a place filled with papers, receipts, photos, notebooks with half-written grocery lists and dates circled without explanations. The desk was a deep brown oak, heavy and scuffed at the edges. We had bought it at a flea market in Pennsylvania nearly 30 years ago. It had brass handles shaped like seashells, though one was missing, replaced with a bent paperclip Sarah had twisted into place and declared charming. I always meant to replace it. I never did. The bottom drawer stuck. It always had. You had to press your knee against the side while pulling with your left hand and lifting slightly with your right. It was a strange, learned rhythm, part muscle memory, part stubbornness. I knelt down and did exactly that. The drawer gave way with a dry rasp, as if reluctant to reveal what it held. Inside were manila folders, yellowed with age, their tabs worn soft at the corners. Most were medical, scans, test results, billing statements. I pulled them out one by one, setting them in a neat pile on the desk. The light above flickered once as I moved. I paused, waited. It steadied. At the very bottom of the drawer was an envelope, thicker than the rest. It was unmarked, except for a single word in Sarah's handwriting. Later. I recognized the way she wrote her L's, long and looping, slightly leaning to the right. The envelope was sealed with a strip of yellowed tape that had peeled slightly at the corner. I didn't open it right away. I just held it in my hand and sat down in her chair, the one with the cushion that still held the faintest trace of her lavender hand lotion. The room smelled like paper and dust, and something older, perhaps a trace of the cedar sachets she used to keep in her drawers, now long faded. I ran my thumb over the envelope's edge. My pulse thudded softly in my ears. When I finally broke the seal, it felt like tearing into something sacred. The paper inside was thick, almost like parchment, folded twice. The first sheet was a list, neat, numbered. Each line began with a date, followed by a few short words. Appointment with Dr. Kerrigan. Blood results. Ask for second opinion. Matt offered to help with finances. Declined. Each entry was precise, unemotional, a record. It was not a diary. It was documentation. One entry stood out, dated 2 months before her death. Unexplained bruising, told Matt, said it was normal. Beneath it, scribbled in smaller writing, was another line. Contacted lawyer. Asked about power of attorney. Still undecided. I turned to the second page. It was a letter, not addressed to anyone, but written with purpose. I don't know how much of this will make sense to you. I didn't want to believe anything bad of him, but some patterns are too sharp to ignore. If anything happens to me that feels too fast, too clean, too planned, don't let it go. You know how to watch. You always knew how to watch. The signature at the bottom was simple. Her name. No date, no goodbye. Just a flat truth laid bare. I folded the pages back carefully and slipped them into a new envelope from the drawer. I labeled it Private SM and sealed it with a fresh piece of tape. I placed it in the lockbox I kept at the bottom of the linen closet, beneath the spare quilts and the unused table runners Sarah never got around to ironing. Back at the desk, I closed the drawer slowly. The sound of the wood sliding against wood was rough and dry, like two tired voices arguing softly in the dark. I sat for a while longer, letting the heater hum and the quiet return. The house settled around me. The walls didn't move, but I felt the shift. Something had tipped. Before leaving the room, I opened the small drawer above the one I'd just closed. Inside was a tiny tin of peppermints, still half full. Sarah used to keep them there to offer guests. I took one, unwrapped it, and placed it on my tongue. It tasted like memory. Sharp, cold, and sweet at once. The hallway outside the study felt different as I stepped back into it, as if I were walking through a version of the house that had only just now become honest. I passed the mirror in the hall and caught my reflection. Older, yes, but alert. Awake in a way I hadn't been in months. In the kitchen, the clock above the stove ticked forward to 7:03. I opened the fridge out of habit, found nothing I wanted, and closed it again. I boiled water for tea instead, the kettle hissing softly, echoing through the quiet house like a whisper building toward a truth. When the tea was ready, I carried it into the living room and sat in Sarah's spot, blanket across my knees, cup warm between my palms. I stared out the window, past the fence, past the trees, into the dark where the street lamp painted an orange pool of light on the sidewalk. A shadow passed through it. I didn't flinch. I already knew what I was looking at, and I was no longer afraid. I woke up before the sun and stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. The fan made a soft ticking sound, not mechanical but rhythmic, like a tired metronome. It reminded me of mornings when Sarah would already be up, padding barefoot through the house in that worn-out robe of hers, humming something half-remembered as she made coffee and opened every curtain. Light was a necessity for her. Even on the days she couldn't lift her arms without trembling, she insisted on letting the sun in. But that morning, I let the room stay gray. It was a Monday, a day meant for banks and offices, for routines. But this one carried a different weight. I could feel it even in the way I tied my shoes, slower, more deliberate. The laces frayed at the ends, stiff from years of use. I'd meant to replace them. I hadn't. Some things, like people, only got noticed when they started to unravel. I made toast and coffee, the bitter kind I used to brew just for myself when Sarah was out. She preferred tea, delicate and sweet. Her ceramic cup still sat by the sink, rim stained faintly from a forgotten brew. I didn't move it. I let it remain as a placeholder, a small stubborn monument to a life paused mid-sentence. The kitchen smelled like old citrus and burnt crumbs. The ticking wall clock above the stove read 7:48. I watched the second hand make its slow journey around the face, then picked up the envelope I had prepared the night before. It was thick with copied documents, all labeled in my slanted script, each sheet a piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was assembling until it was nearly complete. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, old tax returns, and in the center, 2 wills. One was the original, Sarah's, notarized 5 years ago in a calm little office with fake ferns in the window. I remembered the day well. She had worn a navy dress and joked that it felt like writing her own ending. The second was newer, dated 3 months before her death. Signed, sealed, witnessed, and deeply, deeply wrong. The signature at the bottom didn't match. It was her name, yes, but not her hand. Sarah had a way of making her capital S loop downward before rising, like a soft wave curling into shore. The forged signature didn't have that. It was too clean, too symmetrical. It looked like someone trying to imitate a painting with a ruler. I'd compared it to dozens of things. Old birthday cards, bank checks, even the Post-its she used to leave on the fridge. They all had warmth, inconsistency, human texture. This one didn't. I left the house with the envelope under my arm, dressed in my winter coat even though the day had begun to thaw. The air outside was cold and damp, the kind that clings to your bones without freezing you outright. Birds chirped somewhere above the bare branches, confused about the season. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield as I drove downtown, fingers tight on the wheel. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence felt more trustworthy. The office was in a brick building with dusty windows and a buzzer that didn't work on the first try. I had to press it twice before the door clicked open. The waiting room smelled like laminate paper and coffee that had been left on the burner too long. There were stacks of brochures on a metal table. Estate planning simplified. Know your rights as a beneficiary. The quiet power of a living trust. I didn't sit. I stood near the window, watching the reflection of the receptionist's fingers as they danced over her keyboard, rhythmic and unconscious. When the lawyer came out to greet me, I followed him down a narrow hallway lined with framed diplomas. His office was warmer than the rest of the building. There was a radiator beneath the window, hissing faintly. I handed him the envelope without a word. He read in silence for a long time, lips pressed into a line, eyes scanning each page like they were looking for a trick. When he reached the second will, his brows drew together. I sat still, hands folded in my lap. The chair creaked when I shifted. The radiator clicked. He looked up eventually and asked when I first saw the new will. I said it had been introduced casually, by my daughter during a phone call, as if it were just a clerical update. She had said it was something Matt helped Mom put together when things got serious. Her tone had been too light, too certain. That certainty now rang in my ears like an alarm I hadn't heard properly the first time. The lawyer didn't say it was forged, not outright, but he did say the signature would be worth verifying. He told me about handwriting experts, legal paths, the chain of custody for such documents. I nodded, took notes. All the while, the room felt like it was shrinking around me, not from fear, but from a clarity so sharp it felt like pressure in my temples. I left his office with another envelope, this one thinner, stamped, with instructions. I slid it into my coat pocket and walked back out into the chill. The sky had clouded over. A storm was building somewhere north of town. I could feel it in the wind, how it pressed against my coat and turned my scarf into a sail. At home, I went straight to the cabinet where Sarah kept our family records. There, nestled among old photo albums and an empty Christmas card box, I found what I was looking for. A single card from our 20th anniversary. Her handwriting on the inside was unmistakable. I stared at the signature, that gentle looped S, the soft curl of her R, the way she always ended with a long tail on the final H, as if reluctant to finish the name. I brought it to the desk and laid it side by side with the signature on the will. It wasn't even close. I felt something quiet shift inside me. Not anger, not fear, just a kind of anchored resolve. A shape beginning to form, one that had been present for months in the corner of my eye, just waiting to be looked at directly. I made a fresh set of copies and slipped them into another envelope. I labeled it "For Sarah" and placed it in the drawer beside her prayer book, the one she kept under her pillow during chemo. Then I went to the living room and sat in her chair. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt patient. It was still paper, just ink and fibers, but it was beginning to speak, and I was finally ready to listen. It was still dark when I sat down at the writing desk. The house hadn't stirred yet. No distant plumbing groans, no clicks from the refrigerator, not even the roof settling with the dawn. Just the quiet hum of the world turning behind thick walls and closed curtains. I didn't switch on the overhead light. Instead, I lit the small brass desk lamp Sarah used to call the ship lantern because of its curved handle and yellowed shade. The light it gave off was amber, the kind that made the air itself feel older. The desk was hers, technically. She'd used it for thank you notes and grocery lists, birthday cards, and book club minutes. The drawer still smelled faintly of rose lotion and pencil shavings. I ran my hand across the surface. The grain of the wood was soft in places, smoothed from years of her hands resting there while she wrote in long, looping cursive. I opened the drawer slowly and pulled out the pack of linen paper she had once bought at an estate sale. Heavy stock, slightly cream-colored, with a faint deckled edge. She saved it for something important. This seemed to qualify. I chose a black ink pen from the porcelain cup on the corner of the desk, an old cross ballpoint with her initials etched into the barrel. She gave it to me on our 25th anniversary, back when I still wore ties to work and thought signing something in pen was the same as declaring it to the world. I clicked it once and watched the point emerge, steady and quiet. Then I began. The words didn't come in a rush. They came in rows, measured, plain, deliberate. To the office of the district attorney. My name, my address, the date, then the facts. I wrote about the vehicle, the brake line, the metal shavings, the tampering. I described what I had witnessed on the footage, provided exact timestamps. I included names, relationships, connections. I did not embellish. I did not accuse. I simply stated what I had seen and what I had in my possession. The letter grew from a paragraph into two. Short, yes, but full. Enough to catch attention, enough to matter. When I finished, I signed my name with the same care I used when filling out Sarah's hospice paperwork. Slow strokes, steady hand, firm pressure on the final letter. I set the pen down and exhaled through my nose. The room had grown colder. I hadn't noticed until then. A draft came from somewhere, likely under the window frame that had warped years ago during a heavy snow season. I folded the letter precisely into thirds. No envelope yet. Not yet. Instead, I slid it to the side and reached for the manila folder I had prepared days earlier. It held copies of Sarah's original will, the forged one, comparison signatures, the security footage still on the USB drive, the letter she had left me. I labeled the folder, "In the event of further harm." That phrase had been circling in my mind for days. Not just harm to me, but harm to memory, harm to truth. I didn't believe in revenge. I believed in record, in preservation. There was power in putting something into the world on paper. A paper couldn't be talked over. A paper couldn't pretend it hadn't been said. It just was. Beside the folder, I placed a single photograph, one of Sarah in the garden, wearing her straw hat with the frayed brim, the tomato vines curling around her ankles, her hands in the dirt. It wasn't meant as evidence. It was a reminder of what was real, of what mattered, of what had been lost, not to time or disease, but to decision. I walked to the kitchen and set the kettle on the stove. The flame clicked and caught with a whoosh. I stood by the window while the water heated, staring at the frost patterns on the glass. They looked like feathered veins, fragile and temporary, the kind of beauty you only get when the cold is deep enough to stop everything else. When the kettle hissed, I made tea. Her tea, chamomile with a pinch of dried lemon peel, and poured it into the mug with the small chip on the handle. She always turned the chip inward when drinking, so it wouldn't touch her lip. I never asked why. Some habits are shaped by quiet reasons. Back in the study, I placed the letter in a fresh envelope and sealed it with my thumb, pressing down along the edges until I felt the glue give way and hold. I addressed it in clear block letters. No return address. That would come with the folder, if needed. Then I sat. Not because I needed rest, but because something in me refused to move forward just yet. The act of writing the letter felt like a breath I hadn't taken in years. It filled me with a calm I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. There were no sirens in the distance, no phone calls, no pounding on the door. The world didn't react. It just continued. Slowly, and I allowed myself to sit inside that slowness. Later that morning, I walked 2 blocks to the post office. Not the main one, but the small annex near the park, where the mailboxes were blue and rusted, where the clerk still used a manual date stamper. I handed him the letter, watched him press it, watched him drop it into the canvas bin behind the counter. He didn't look up, just went on with his work. I stepped outside and stood for a moment, breathing in the crisp air. A boy rode past on a scooter, his scarf trailing behind him like a ribbon. The park across the street was quiet, the benches empty, the swings still. I stood there for a long time, watching nothing in particular. The letter was gone, but the echo of it remained. A small, deliberate truth now out in the world. It didn't shout. It didn't accuse. It simply existed, just like she once had. And that, I thought, was enough for now. The knock came mid-afternoon, just after I had finished vacuuming the living room for the third time that week. I wasn't expecting anyone. The sun had dipped behind the clouds, and the light in the room turned the color of old paper. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the sidewalk in frantic spirals. I had opened the window an hour earlier to let in some air, but the breeze had gone sharp. The curtain danced, then fell still. The knock came again, 2 short taps, followed by silence. I wiped my hands on the towel draped over my shoulder and opened the door. 2 men stood there, both in dark coats. One was taller, with a thin folder tucked under his arm, the kind clerks carry. The other wore gloves and looked younger, but his eyes had the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep. They introduced themselves with badges, names I didn't catch, though I nodded like I did. One of them asked if they could come in. I stepped aside. They didn't remove their coats. They didn't sit, just stood in the middle of the room, careful not to touch anything. I noticed how one of them kept glancing around, eyes skimming over furniture, walls, photos. The taller one asked if I had mailed anything recently. I said yes. He asked if I could describe what. I said I could. He didn't ask me to. He only nodded, then asked if I had a moment to speak. I said I had plenty of those. They asked about the car, about the garage, about the brake line. I gave them the same quiet answers I'd written in the letter. I spoke slowly, watching their faces for disbelief or doubt. There was none, just a kind of professional listening, the sort people use when they're trained not to interrupt. When I finished, the younger one glanced at the folder and flipped it open. I didn't lean in. I didn't need to see. Whatever they had, it brought them here. That was enough. They didn't stay long. When they left, the taller one thanked me. The younger nodded. They said I might be contacted again. I told them I would be home. After the door closed behind them, I stood in the hallway for a while, coat still draped over the back of a dining chair, shoes by the radiator where they had been drying from yesterday's walk. The clock above the pantry chimed 4 times. I turned toward the kitchen, not out of hunger, but because I needed to move. I needed to find something to touch, to hold, to steady myself against the stillness that had crept in behind the men. I opened the cabinet beneath the sink, where Sarah had once kept the box of old preserves and small things she didn't want to throw away. Spare lids, rubber bands, a tin of dried lavender that still leaked its scent through the paper. My hands moved on their own, pushing aside sponges and brittle cloths until they landed on a familiar shape. It was a perfume bottle, glass, square-edged, heavy in the palm. The label had worn away over the years, but the silver cap was still intact, slightly tarnished. I unscrewed it and lifted it to my nose. There it was. The scent. Not strong, not full, but unmistakable. That dry, powdery sweetness that clung to Sarah's scarves, to the collar of her nightgown, to the seatbelt in the passenger side of the car. I hadn't smelled it since the hospital packed her belongings in a brown paper bag, labeled with her name in black marker. The scent hadn't survived the cleaning solvents they used. I had tried, but it was gone from everything she'd worn in those last weeks. Except this. I held the bottle for a long time. The glass was cool, smooth. I pressed it to my cheek without thinking, and for a brief moment, it felt like her hand. That ridiculous thought made my throat close up. I sat down on the floor, back against the cabinet door, and placed the bottle in my lap. I remembered the day she'd bought it. We were in New York, She had found it in a tiny shop near Bryant Park, a place with too many mirrors and a bell above the door that jingled like sleighs. She sprayed it onto her wrist, held it up to my face, and asked, "Too old lady?" I told her it smelled like someone who knew what she wanted. She bought it without hesitation. She used it sparingly, special occasions mostly, anniversaries, dinners, church on Easter. But sometimes, in the middle of winter, she would put a dab behind her ears just to remind herself she was still here. That's how she put it. Still here. I capped the bottle and set it gently on the counter. Then I walked to the hallway closet and pulled down the small wooden box we kept at the top. It was Sarah's memory box. Photos, letters, ticket stubs, napkins with lipstick blots. I added the perfume bottle inside, between a folded concert program and a Valentine's Day card I'd given her when we were still dating. Back in the living room, I poured myself a glass of water. The light was fading fast, turning the walls amber. I didn't switch on the lamps. I let the dusk settle in. I could feel something had shifted, not just in the house, but outside of it. Somewhere in the chain of events I'd set in motion, gears had begun to move, quietly, but deliberately. The mail slot clicked. A small envelope slid onto the mat near the front door. I stood without rushing, picked it up. The envelope was blank except for a printed return address, legal firm, same one that handled Sarah's will. Inside was a short note, typed. It informed me that a second copy of the amended will had been found. It had been withdrawn from probate pending further inquiry. The paper smelled faintly of toner and glue, but under that, something else. Maybe nothing. Maybe a trace of the office where it had been handled, or maybe just my imagination assigning weight to weightless things. I folded the letter and placed it on the hallway table beside the keys. I returned to the kitchen. The tea kettle was still warm on the stove. I turned on the burner, and as it began to hum again, I placed both hands on the counter, closed my eyes, and breathed in the fading scent of her perfume, now embedded in the seams of the room. She was still here, and so was I. It was raining when I opened the attic. Not a dramatic storm, just the kind of rain that falls steadily without pause, soft and indifferent. The kind that fills gutters and makes the wooden steps creak with moisture. The house always seemed to settle differently when it rained, like it exhaled something. The walls grew more silent, the floorboards more honest. I had avoided the attic for years. Even Sarah had stopped going up there long ago. But that morning, after the letter and the perfume and the slow burn of knowing things were no longer hidden, I pulled down the ladder and climbed. The air smelled of dust and cedar, and time, that dry, granular scent that only exists in places sealed off from the present. I hadn't brought a flashlight. Instead, I opened the small window on the gable end. Rain streaked diagonally across the glass, warping the gray light into something yellowish and warm. Enough to see the shapes, boxes, an old suitcase, a rocking horse missing one ear, the stack of Sarah's college yearbooks wrapped in twine. I sat on an old trunk and looked around. The insulation had peeled in some corners, revealing beams spotted with age and old nail holes. There was a stillness in that space that didn't ask for anything. I stayed there for a long time before reaching for the first box. The cardboard tore slightly as I lifted the flaps. Inside were calendars, dozens of them. Not just store-bought planners, but the wall calendars Sarah used to hang every January in the kitchen. She had saved each one, neatly stacked, from 1987 onward. Every square was filled. Appointments, birthdays, dinner guests, reminders to call Eleanor, notes like first snow or bad coffee at John's. Some squares had small hearts drawn in the corner. Some had exclamation points. Some were just days with nothing but a check mark. Done. Lived. I flipped to the one from last year. The final few months had fewer markings. A hospital date here. Matt stopped by there. And then, in shaky ink, "No taste today. could still smell pine outside. That was in November. My hand trembled as I closed the box and moved to the next. This one held letters. Most were addressed to me, never sent, written during the first year of our marriage. Sarah's handwriting back then was sharper, more angular, like she was still figuring out how to be herself on paper. One letter began with, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to say it anyway." I didn't read the rest. Not yet. Beneath the letters was a photograph. It was us, taken with a timer, on the beach during a road trip to the Carolinas. We were both barefoot, standing ankle-deep in water, her dress lifted just enough to keep from dragging. My arm was around her, and she was laughing at something I couldn't remember. I stared at that photo until the edges of it blurred. Not from tears, from time. I found her watch next. A slim gold one with a cracked face and a leather strap that had hardened into its last worn shape. The hour hand was stuck between 10 and 11. I wound it gently, more out of habit than hope, and listened. Nothing. It had died, probably long before she did, tucked away and forgotten. Still, I strapped it onto my wrist and left it there. Before I left the attic, I opened the suitcase. Inside were fabric scraps, pins, a sewing kit with missing needles, and a scarf I had never seen before, blue and green, with stitched initials on the corner. Not her own, but mine. HM. The stitching was rough, uneven. She must have made it for me but never given it. I folded it carefully and placed it in my coat pocket, the way she used to tuck small things into my jacket before I left for work. A mint, a note, a folded grocery list I'd never remembered to check. Back downstairs, the house felt smaller somehow. Not claustrophobic, just more full. As if everything I'd carried down from the attic had reactivated something in the walls. I brewed a pot of coffee, not the cheap kind I'd switched to after she passed, but the French roast she always claimed was too strong, too bold, and then drank anyway, every time. I used the floral mug with the chipped rim, the one she always called her thinking cup. I took the coffee to the sunroom and opened the windows just a crack. The smell of rain drifted in, mixed with damp leaves and something faintly metallic. I placed the calendar box on the table and flipped through random pages, landing on a square that read, "Talked too much at dinner. He didn't mind." There was a kind of love in that line that didn't need punctuation. I sat there until the coffee went cold and the light began to fade. The rain hadn't stopped. It continued with its slow, unchanging rhythm, like time itself, if you stripped it of urgency. As night crept in, I stood and turned on the lamp near the bookshelf, the one with the frayed cord she had once wrapped in floral tape to keep it from looking sad. I left the calendars where they were, open on the page where we had written, "Drive to Vermont." We never took that drive. Instead, I walked to the hallway, to the mirror. My reflection looked softer now, not because anything had changed, but because something had eased. The weight I had carried, the waiting, the fear, the suspicion, it was all still there. But now it lived alongside the parts of her I had gathered throughout the day. The scent in the perfume, the scrawled notes, the watch that no longer ticked, the scarf that had never been worn. I was no closer to resolution, but I had touched time. And for once, time had touched back. The phone didn't ring that morning. The mail didn't arrive early. The neighbor's dog didn't bark at the recycling truck. The wind didn't rattle the shutters the way it usually did when the temperature dropped overnight. Nothing announced itself. The day came in like breath on glass, soft, fogged, barely there. I woke without an alarm, the house as still as it had been in the hour before sunrise. My body moved with a kind of practiced slowness, not from pain, but from a quiet understanding that there was no reason to rush. The kettle took longer to boil than usual, or maybe I just noticed its hissing more. I poured the water over the coffee grounds the way Sarah used to. Slow spirals, even pressure, the kind of care you only give to small things when the big things feel out of reach. I drank from her mug that morning. The yellow one with the little blue flowers faded along the lip. The glaze had cracked into a fine web of lines over the years. I had always offered to replace it, but she said the lines gave it warmth. Like skin, she told me once. It's not real until it breaks a little. I watched the sun stretch across the kitchen tiles, the same golden pattern that had moved across our mornings for decades. There were crumbs in the corner of the table and a tiny dried ring of tea from the night before. I didn't wipe them away. The letter came late, not through the mail. It was hand-delivered, tucked into a simple envelope, no return address, just my name written in block letters. It was slipped through the door slot while I was in the back garden, checking the fence line, not because it needed checking, but because I had nothing else to do, and the rosemary was starting to lean. I found the envelope on the doormat, slightly bent where it had caught the edge of the tile. The paper was thick, heavier than standard stock, and the ink smelled faintly of iron. I carried it to the dining table, the one with the long scratch across the center from the year we tried to move it without lifting. I opened the envelope with the same knife I used for fruit, the one Sarah used to sharpen on the bottom of the ceramic mug because it worked just as well as a stone. The letter inside was short, half a page, the typewritten lines precise, impersonal, legal. It stated that after review, the amended will had been invalidated. The original will, Sarah's true will, had been reinstated in full. A formal statement would be mailed to all parties within 5 business days. There was no mention of Matt's name, no accusation, no narrative, just correction. I read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it on top of the bookshelf, beside the photo of Sarah standing in the snow, her eyes squinting from the brightness, scarf too big for her face. The one she hated because she said it made her look small. It didn't. It made her look exactly how I remembered her. Real. I sat in her chair by the window and looked out over the yard. The sky had turned to that particular shade of blue that only arrives once a year. Too pale to be summer, too clean to be winter. The kind of blue that doesn't stay long. Matt didn't call. Neither did my daughter. I wasn't surprised. They were quiet now in the way people become when a story ends differently than they expected. I imagined Matt sitting in his home office, the kind with brushed steel and frosted glass, looking at his computer screen, rereading the email, wondering how something so small had become so large, wondering when the turn had happened, wondering how the wheel had slipped from his hands. I didn't feel triumph. That wasn't the word. It was smaller, like placing a book back on the shelf after a long night, like hearing the heater click on when the room starts to cool. In the afternoon, I walked to the lake. I hadn't been there in months. The path still had the same divots, the same overgrown edges. I brought Sarah's scarf with me, the blue and green one she made with my initials stitched into the corner. I wore it loose around my neck, the way she had folded it on the coat hook the day she finished it, smiling like she had built something secret into its threads. I sat on the bench overlooking the water, the same one we had sat on every Thanksgiving morning, just the two of us, even when it was too cold to be out. The water was still, holding the sky like a mirror. In my coat pocket, I carried the broken watch, the one that had belonged to her. I hadn't fixed it. I didn't plan to. Some things lose their need to keep time. Some things just need to be held. As I sat there, a breeze moved across the lake, lifting the edge of the scarf against my chin. I closed my eyes. It wasn't forgiveness I felt, and it wasn't peace. It was something quieter, the kind of silence that happens when a clock stops ticking, and you realize, maybe for the first time, that the room hasn't changed. Only the listening has.